What would you do if your job every day for 20 years was to move a mountain? Not with machines, not with explosives, but with the strength of your muscles, your ropes, and your unshakable faith. Feel the desert sun beating down on your back. This isn't a pleasant warmth, it's a physical weight, a relentless hammer that strikes you without pause, so intense that sweat evaporates from your skin before it has a chance to fall. Taste the limestone dust that clings to your throat. It is a perpetual thirst, a dryness that the warm, silty water of the Nile can barely quench. The taste of the mountain you are building is always in your mouth. Listen to the deafening cacophony of creation. It is the rhythmic strike of thousands of stone hammers against rock, the sharp groan of papyrus ropes as thick as your arms strain to their limit, and above it all, the chant of your crew, a guttural mantra for moving 2-ton blocks. Watch as the shadow of the perfect geometric structure you are building creeps across the chaotic camp. It is a stone god devouring the daylight, a constant reminder of the sheer scale of your task. This is not a metaphor for hard work. For tens of thousands of men in ancient Egypt, this was their one brutal reality. This was the life of a pyramid builder. What you are about to hear is not the legend of whips and slaves that Hollywood told us. It is the true story, unearthed from the sand and written in the bones of the men who paid the blood price too. Build a stairway to the stars for their god. To understand these men, you must first understand their world. Place yourself in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, more than 4,500 years ago. It is the height of the Pyramid Age on the sacred Giza Plateau. And you must ask, why? Why dedicate so many lives, so many resources, to building these artificial mountains? The answer is simple and all-encompassing: the survival of the universe. The pyramid was not just a tomb, it was a resurrection machine. The pharaoh, be it Khufu, Khafre, or Menkaure, was a god on earth, the incarnation of Horus. His death was not an end, but a dangerous transition. He had to navigate the underworld to be reborn as Osiris, the god of the afterlife. If the pharaoh succeeded, Ma'at, the cosmic order, balance, justice, would be maintained. The Nile would flood the lands at the right season. The harvests would be plentiful. The sun would rise each morning, and Egypt would prosper. If he failed, chaos would consume the world. Therefore, building the pyramid was not a secular job. It was the most important national project, an act of religious service that guaranteed the survival of your family, your people, of everything you knew. And those who built it were not foreign slaves. Forget the images of Hebrew slaves. That is an error of millennia. They were Egyptian citizens. They were farmers, conscripted into a rotating labor system, a corvée, during the months of the Nile's inundation. When your fields were underwater and you could not farm, you served your god king, and in doing so, you served yourself. The journey to Giza did not begin with the crack of a whip, but with the arrival of a pharaoh's scribe in your village. It was a call to duty, a summons for the greatest project humanity had ever known. Imagine your life as a farmer, governed by the eternal rhythm of the Nile. The sowing, the growing, the reaping. Your life depends on the river, and then, when the river covers everything, the pharaoh's official arrives. He reads the records, notes your name. You bid farewell to your family, not as a slave dragged away by force, but as a soldier departing for a sacred campaign. You travel by boat on the great river, alongside hundreds of men from other villages, towards a vision that is both inspiring and terrifying on the horizon. The Giza worksite, a wound in the earth crowned by a growing mountain. And this is where modern archaeology demolished the old myth. Upon arrival, you were not thrown into a miserable slave camp. You were taken to a city, a lost city, discovered under the sand by archaeologist Mark Linner, whose name was Hait El Ghurab, the city of the workers. It was not a makeshift camp. It was a planned metropolis with streets, districts, and astonishing logistics. There were industrial-scale bakeries, capable of baking thousands of loaves a day, breweries producing the drink that was both food and wage, fishmongers processing tons of fish from the Nile, and enormous rectangular galleries that served as dormitories for the work crews. You, the farmer, had traded your seasonal freedom for a place in this system. The state fed you, housed you, and gave you a divine purpose. You were a valuable asset, a human cog in the pharaoh's colossal machine. This city is the silent testament to the incredible organizational power of the ancient Egyptian state. To understand how this machine worked, we must zoom in on its fuel, bread and beer. Workers' daily ration was not mere sustenance. It was his salary, his energy, and in a way his medicine. Egyptian beer was not as we know it. It was thick, nutritious, rich in carbohydrates and vitamins. It was called liquid bread. It was the main source of calories for strenuous labor and, being fermented, was much safer to drink than river water. Receiving your ration of beer and bread was the daily proof that you were a valued worker, not a slave. It was literally the fuel that moved. Mountains of stone. Now, let's zoom out. The pyramid was not a simple expense, a megalomaniacal whim. It was the economic engine of the Old Kingdom. This massive project centralized the pharaoh's power, forcing the entire country to work towards a common goal. It drove innovation in engineering, in administration, in logistics, and in labor organization, and fundamentally, it redistributed the nation's wealth. Surplus grain from harvests across Egypt was transported to Giza to feed the workers. The project was the Apollo program of its time, a national enterprise that defined its civilization and pushed its limits. The first step in building eternity, and the most brutal, was to tear the stone from the bowels of the earth. This was the white hell of the quarries. Transport yourself to the limestone quarries of Tura, on the other side of the Nile, or to the distant granite quarries of Aswan. The heat is blinding, reflected by the white rock until it burns your eyes. The air does not move. The sound is torture. Thousands of dolerite hammers, an incredibly hard volcanic rock, striking the limestone in a thunderous, constant rhythm. The air is thick with a fine white dust that gets into your mouth, your eyes, and worst of all, your lungs. With every breath, you inhaled the cause of future respiratory diseases, the silicosis that would kill you slowly. The technique was as ingenious as it was exhausting. They had no iron. Their tools were copper chisels which blunted constantly, and the sheer force of their muscles. To extract the enormous blocks, they carved channels into the rock. Then, they inserted dry wooden wedges into the cracks and soaked them with water. For hours, they poured water onto the wood, which swelled slowly, expanding with a silent, unstoppable force. Finally, with a dull groan, a 2.5-ton block would break away from the mother mountain. Physics and patience were their most powerful tools. This was, without a doubt, the most dangerous work. And we know this because the dead speak. The workers' cemeteries, discovered near the city, tell the real story. Their skeletons are the true papyri of their suffering. They show an extremely high rate of traumatic injuries. Fingers and limbs crushed by blocks, skull fractures, and above all, extreme wear on the spine, the vertebrae compressed and deformed by years of carrying inhuman weights. Once torn from the earth, the stone block began its long journey, moving it from the quarry to the pyramid under construction was a triumph of organization, brute force, and human cooperation. Imagine the scene. A block of limestone, the size of a small car, mounted on a huge wooden sledge. In front of it, dozens of men, divided into 2 rows, pull on thick papyrus ropes. The sun punishes them. The effort is maximal, but they have a secret. A man walks in front of the sledge, pouring water onto the sand, not to settle the dust, but to reduce friction. This simple technique, confirmed by a painting found in the tomb of a nomarch named Jehutiotep, have the effort needed to drag the sledge, and as they pull, they sing. These are not songs of lament, but rhythmic work chants. A foreman sets the beat, and they all pull in unison. It is the only way to concentrate the strength of 50 men into a single, coordinated movement. But these men were not an anonymous mass. Thanks to graffiti found on the pyramids themselves, we know they were organized into divisions, and these, in turn, into smaller teams. And these teams had names. Proud, competitive, sometimes even humorous names. One team called themselves the Friends of Khufu. Another, the Drunkards of Menkaure. This group identity was a stroke of psychological genius. It created a sense of camaraderie, of pride, and of healthy rivalry. Our crew moved more blocks today than the Drunkards of Menkaure. Belonging to a team gave you a purpose. You were not a number. You were one of the Friends of Khufu. You were competing for your team's honor in the nation's most sacred task. This simple humanization is the most powerful proof against the myth of the faceless slave. To understand the reality of Giza, we must contrast two lives, that of the architect and that of the laborer. The architect of the Great Pyramid was probably the vizier Hemiunu, nephew of Pharaoh Khufu. Picture him in his tent, shielded from the sun. His tools are papyri, reed pens, scale models of the pyramid. He studies the stars to achieve the structure's perfect alignment with the cardinal points. His statue, which survives today, shows him well-fed, powerful, serene. He designs eternity. Now look at the anonymous worker, standing under that same sun. His tools are his hands, a rope, and a stone hammer. He does not study the stars, but the rock before him. His body is the instrument that executes Hemiunu's plan. His skeleton, lying in the sand, shows him worn out, with severe arthritis and a life expectancy of barely 35 years. He builds eternity with the years of his own life. This duality exposes the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of their world. Despite the brutal conditions and dangerous work, the builders were not disposable. The pharaoh's state, immensely practical, knew that a skilled worker was a valuable resource. That is why it invested in keeping them alive and working. Imagine an accident, a block that slips, a rope that snaps, a cry of pain. The reaction is immediate. His crewmates pull him from danger. He is taken to the site's doctors, specialists in workplace trauma. The evidence for this is again in their bones. In the workers' cemetery, archaeologists have found skeletons with terrible fractures in arms and legs that show signs of having been set correctly in splints and having healed, albeit with deformities. They have found skulls with holes from trepanation, a primitive brain surgery, where the bone around the cut shows signs of regrowth, meaning the patient survived. The operation for months or even years. They received a level of medical care that would never be granted to an expendable slave. The state repaired its broken cogs so they could return to work. But not even the best medicine could stop the wear and tear. Life was short and painful. Most died before they reached 40. Their final comfort, and perhaps the most powerful religious incentive of all, was the promise of an honorable death. They were not thrown into a mass grave. They were buried with respect in their own cemetery, in the shadow of the pyramid they had helped build. They were interred in modest tombs with small jars of bread and beer to sustain them on their journey through the afterlife. Building the stairway to heaven for their God gave them the chance, perhaps, to use it themselves. And then, one day, after 20 years of labor, the last block was set in place. The pyramid was sealed. The legacy of these thousands of workers was split in two. One, visible to the entire world and for all of history. The other, hidden beneath the sand. Imagine for a moment the sight of the Great Pyramid newly finished. Forget the image we see today of sand-colored blocks. Visualize it as its builders saw it. A dazzling structure completely covered in plates of white Tura limestone, polished to a brilliant sheen. It reflected the sunlight so blindingly, and at the very top, the pyramidion, the final capstone, possibly covered in gold or electrum, shone like an artificial star. It was a mountain of light. For the men who built it, the feeling of awe, of pride, and of divine purpose must have been overwhelming. That is the visible legacy, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But the invisible legacy, the one we have only recently discovered, is perhaps more important. It is their bones, their city, the remains of their bread and beer. It is through archaeology and the study of their mortal remains that today, at last, we can tell their true story and give a voice to those anonymous men. For the builder, the suffering was worth it. He did not just build a king's tomb. He actively participated in maintaining the order of the universe. His short, brutal, painful life had a cosmic purpose. He sacrificed his mortal body on the altar of his God's eternity, and in doing so, ensured the survival of his nation. Imagine for one last moment, that man, covered in limestone dust, his hands torn and his back bent from the strain. He looks up. He does not see a tomb. He sees the sun reflected on a mountain of light, the stairway he helped build so that his God could ascend to the stars and ensure that the Nile would once again flood his fields next year. His body is broken, but his spirit believes it has touched immortality. The story of the pyramid builders is more complex and human than the legend. It is not a tale of oppressors and slaves, but of how faith, organization, and a shared purpose can, quite literally, move mountains. It is a reminder that humanity's greatest monuments are not built only of stone, but of the sweat, the bones, and the unshakable belief of thousands of ordinary people who sacrificed themselves for something they considered greater than their own lives. Now that you know the true story of the builders, has your perception of the pyramids changed? Do you believe the physical sacrifice of thousands of workers was justified by the religious and social purpose they believed in? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this journey through dust and faith has revealed a new perspective to you, subscribe. Here, we don't just tell history, we relive it.